It's great to be here today with Dr. Simon Perry, talking about his new book, Jesus Farted, the Vulgar Truth of the Biblical Christ. It's great to be with you here, Simon, today.
You too, Max.
I thought I'd just kick off with some sort of very general ideas about where the book has come from and the kind of ideas that allowed it, that shaped it, basically. You mentioned in the book that one of your first anecdotes, and it's full of anecdotes, very funny ones. You open with this story about this Oxford theology class. Have you had the idea since then? You know, where has this come from?
At the time, that was just a funny story. This was the idea that the ancient Greek language that the New Testament is written in, the word for breaking bread that's used there is very similar to the modern Greek verb for breaking wind.
Yeah.
And somebody just accidentally read the wrong verb because modern Greek was their first language. And if you can imagine that in a communion setting, it can be amusing, but it depends on your temperament. Why is it that people don't find it amusing? Why is it that people do? I suppose that's one of the questions. But no, to be honest, at the time, that was just a funny story that you remember.
Sure.
It's just that over the course of time, I think, although there are various flashpoints, there's a dawning realization that people don't tend to treat Jesus as a real human. So while I was still in Oxford, I was in trouble at one stage for referring to Jesus as a bloke.
Okay.
And I couldn't quite work out what the trouble was, but what's behind that? What makes people apprehensive about seeing Jesus as a bloke?
Well, this has great theological origin as you explore. You mentioned Docetism, that this very early conviction in the early church about whether or not Christ was fully human or fully divine. So maybe these ideas are a lot older than we think. It comes into sort of clash with what you said about him being a bloke. That he's supposed to be not normal. He's supposed to be unlike us in some way.
It's true, I suppose. Yeah, I mean the heresy. I mean, heresy is a pretty late invention.
Sure.
But the word really means that Jesus only seemed human. He wasn't properly human.
Sure.
And it's difficult for most people to imagine that on the one hand, Jesus is a carpenter. Everyone accepts that, but people tend to imagine him making rocking chairs or something. You know, I remember seeing on I think it was the most recent Ben-Hur movie. I think he was planing a Victorian you know, for a Victorian townhouse. But no, it's more likely he was a builder, certainly a tradesman of some sort, probably working on these massive building projects in cities that are never mentioned in the Bible, but were within probably an hour's walking distance of where he grew up. But if you accept that this is what Jesus was doing for the first 30 years of his life, surely you also have to accept that sometimes he will have stubbed his toe or hit his thumb with a hammer or got sawdust in his eye.
Yes.
Can people picture those things about Jesus? And if not, why not? I think that's one of the big questions. And as you know, I suppose the early chapters begin with some of my own experiences in, I think we call them portable cabins now. You know, these sort of rough places where I worked in the military on oil refineries, on building sites and so on. And these places are full of tradesmen, people who are unlikely to ever know any different. And the kind of conversation that you have in those is very different to what we would have in the bar at college or in the senior common room.
Right.
But that kind of conversation is no less insightful, no less morally grounded, no less sophisticated. It's just there's a different dynamic at play. And that will have been Jesus's primary social setting.
Yes.
Slightly anachronistic, I realise, you know, we're kind of imposing a little bit on the historical Jesus here. But it's more likely that Jesus was a rough porter cabin tradesperson than he was a nice white knighty. You picture him, you know, with his
you use the term tediously well behaved, I think, which is the kind of, maybe you argue, a kind of false image of Jesus, and perhaps what the book is trying to do is bring him back into the setting, the former setting you mentioned, the kind of the porter cabin setting.
Yeah, I think we're supposed to say portable cabin. I've
Portable
discovered.
cabin.
Yeah,
I see. Okay.
but yeah, no,
Um,
you're right. You're right.
I wanted to touch on, you mentioned just there about the sort of the anecdotal parts of the writing, and you weave it through so well between, this very sophisticated theology, great scriptural insights, and then you manage to take us into these great sort of episodes of your own life, really, and that exchange is really well done. And it's obviously not, that's not a path well trodden for people. I think people, if you're writing theology, you're somehow writing something that isn't about yourself, perhaps by its very nature. Did it feel natural for you to always want to include moments in your own life? Did that feel like a kind of something that you felt you had to do the story justice?
It feels unnatural not doing it,
Okay.
but it still feels like you're on thin ice when you bring vulgar language into play. But having
Mm.
said that, the New Testament is written in vulgar language. It's Koine
Yeah.
Greek. I think the Latin, one of the Latin translations is called the Vulgate. This is vulgar stuff.
Yeah.
Um, Lots of the more cruder elements of the Bible have been filtered out by modernity, which has really not helped in promoting a real Jesus. And now I've completely forgotten what the question was.
I was asking about the anecdotal and the relationship between the theology and your anecdotes.
Oh yeah. Well, I suppose the one of the things that always strikes me is that there are very few people from the world of the portable cabin who wear orange overalls and get dirt under their fingernails. Very few of those people ever will make it either into a university or into a church setting. So it's unusual that people from that background will be in a position where they can stand up and talk in these really frank terms.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, even when they do, and I think even when I did, it feels like, no, you're in a different world now. Jesus doesn't belong to that world. He belongs to this one. So you get the program and regardless of your background, it's easy to get drawn into the trap of promoting a Jesus who's just hampered by English politeness and doesn't really engage with the real stuff that real people face in real life. And I think the moment that you can accept the crudity that is most people's reality today and the crudity of Jesus's world, then something important is happening that I still think remains largely untapped. There are some great people working on this now. Luke Larner, for instance, is one example. There are some historical Jesus scholars. I think it's James Crossley working along similar lines. There are people doing interesting stuff now, but it's very, very tentative. And I think these people are largely seen as outsiders and a long way from mainstream, put it that way.
But perhaps in the very space that Christ himself would have occupied, right, on the mainstream, sorry, out of the mainstream, on the, on in this marginal space. So, part of the way you frame the sort of the history of the way that Christianity has been, and specifically the New Testament has been taken and reinterpreted, is that it becomes a central part of the imperial cult. It becomes a part of a new kind of religious order that isn't the one that would speak from the margins, that would speak from this position of the other, use the term the other. There's a process of moving Christ into some sort of political elite. Can you speak more about that change and whether that's one of my questions? Sorry, sort of part of that is whether that happens through translation, whether that kind of obscures it, or whether it's just the kind of the force of kind of putting Christ into a new context, making him a figure of the political establishment as opposed to an outsider.
It's a very tricky one, isn't it? I contributed to a series of books called After Christendom, which really draws out that precise question well. A series edited by Stuart Murray Williams. It's easy to oversimplify this narrative, but by and large, in the 4th century, Emperor Constantine essentially takes over the empire. The empire is split, the Roman Empire is split into 4 distinct parts, is sprawling mass, 4 different emperors. Constantine sets out to unify the title like some great boxing champion. But when you've got such a massive, sprawling empire like this, you need some kind of a social glue to hold it all together, because it's impossible to police something this big. And Christianity, it looks, because it had penetrated every level of society, looked like the perfect social, moral framework that you can use to try and establish order for your regime. So it looks as though somebody like Constantine wanted the kingdom, but not the king. He wanted the throne.
Right.
I think that's what he wanted. And yeah, people from my background, perhaps oversimplistically, but tend to regard Christianity as the product of this shift to turn what we had in the Bible, which was subversive, anti-imperial, but not politically revolutionary and in a sort of a Marxist sense, or a sort of a violent armed rebellion sense. Jesus had a very specific line that he trod through the huge range of political factions that were sort of all vying for power in Jesus's day. But words like, I mean, the New Testament, such a subversive document. Words like kingdom now we tend to think of as a country or something. Sure. It was just a word for authority. Didn't become a word for a location until Shakespeare, Elizabethan era, and so on. Salvation was a Roman emperor's title. Gospel is almost an enforced celebration of the enthronement or the arrival of a new emperor.
Yes.
Lots of these words that we think are religious words were taken up in the New Testament and played with. And that play is just lost entirely. It gets turned into a religious document. They sound like religious words, and you end up with a religious Jesus who is a long way from the bloke who probably would have farted in a portable cabin.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's what the book very powerfully presents. I mean, one other sort of interesting translation point that I picked up on is the word, and it's not just that the translation can change the emphasis, it can really completely subvert what the idea is as a whole. So one is metanoia, which is something like, well, in modern Christianity, something like repentance, but really meant something like a sort of transformation, a transformation of state.
Metanoia means that you sort of move from one place to another.
Right. Okay, perfect. We were talking about metanoia. We were talking about the way that in a later rendering of Christianity, perhaps a Christianity that was a part of this political order, which changed a word like metanoia, which means the radical change of opinion, a kind of a complete subversion of one's convictions, and turns it into this much weaker, perhaps much more religious, as you say, religious word, repentance. Can you talk a bit more about the difference that the translation can make in terms of how we access some of these central parts of Jesus's doctrine?
It's an interesting question. I mean, in its original, meta is the word for after, noia is the word for mind. Where I think if you're properly northern, you might tell somebody to use their nous. So it's an after-mindedness. And most people's minds are not just already made up, but thoroughly shaped.
Yes.
So changing your mind is a major thing. Now, of course, you can change your mind about whether or not you something trivial over who's better, Aston Villa or Manchester United. You can change your mind on something like that unless you support one of those teams. But it's a fairly trivial thing to do. And I think metanoia in the New Testament can refer to that trivial stuff, but usually it refers to something much weightier. And although open-mindedness is very much a modern virtue, we tend to require open-mindedness of other people. And because we think not just with our minds, but as the book draws out, with our hearts, our stomachs, our bowels, our genitals, we are thinking with our entire being. So that to change your mind about something is a much bigger deal than I think people realize. And it's almost impossible to do that. So I think this is why repentance is such a big deal, or at least why metanoia is such a big deal. And I think this is partly why death and resurrection lies at the heart of what Christianity has become, because it to change your mind about anything requires a mini death and resurrection. An old world is broken down. You're invited to inhabit a new world. I mean, that's what poetry is. It's what literature is. It's what art is.
Sure.
It has the capacity to do those things. How it's degenerated into groveling to say sorry to a supernatural mind-reading judge who's about to send you to an eternity of being poked by horrible things in horrible places because once upon a time you broke an impossible to follow law. Where on earth did that come from? But that is everywhere in Christianity today. And I think it probably has its origins in trying to encourage the masses to be socially compliant with whatever ideology is
expedient. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and that ties together a lot of the different strands that the book has. I wonder if I can move the discussion on a bit and think a bit about why the fart is such an important part of the book. Not only the book's the central sort of premise of the book that Jesus' humanity is displayed through his capacity to break wind like the rest of us, but I wonder whether the fart has its echoes can be felt much wider throughout the book,
depending on what you've eaten.
Yeah, it's true. But I wonder why you thought the fart was an interesting word to go for, an interesting sort of way of collecting a lot of different ideas up, because you move from thinking about the bowels of the Old Testament to thinking about Zizek's relationship with the toilet in contemporary society. So yes. I wonder whether this kind of level of using this kind of vulgarity, why that was a really useful thing for you in the book, if it was at all.
The trigger moment for that was for this channel. Miriam Margolyes very graciously joined us to be interviewed, and of course part of interviewing Miriam Margolyes means learning about her view of farting, and because she has a lot to say about it, and actually she had it's more serious, I think, than just making people laugh. You try to unpack why it is that it makes people laugh, and I think it's probably because more often than not it transgresses social boundaries. So for instance, if you're in the portable cabin and you sort of rattle your cack flaps, as it were, nobody will bat an eyelid unless it's a particularly toxic experience. Nobody thinks it's funny. Somebody might swear at you. It's not remotely funny because it's not breaking any taboos.
No.
If you do that in the middle of a moment of quiet in a church or in a university lecture, or these suddenly, why is everyone trying not to laugh?
Yeah.
There's something about it as well. It can transgress these social boundaries, and I think it is the great equalizer. It's the real sign of humanity. Right. And I think it was really in conversation with a Polish scholar testing some of these ideas out, Patricia Austin from the University of Rzeszów, just floating these ideas with her. I think she drew attention to how wide-ranging this might be, and the fact that it would resonate with lots of people, which it seems to. I thought people would be much more offended than they are. I think so much of who we are is built around pretense. We want to project a certain image. I'm not saying that's wrong or anything, but probably more often than we're conscious. We're performing, we're interfacing with people, we have a facade to maintain, we interface with people, there are social rules that we follow. And just now and again being reminded of the fact that there is something more, something other to us.
Yeah.
This is why Miriam says it brings people together, because so much of what we do now works in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So it's the great unifier. It's yeah. And as you say earlier, your portrayal earlier of Christ, who would be more indigenous to the world of the portable cabin than he would to the corridors of power or a university lecturer, would suggest that this is a shared humanity. This is something very common, and I don't mean common as in a derogatory way. I mean that's something that we share.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yes, that feels like one of the central currents of the book. Um, a question I have about perhaps the relationship between the Jesus and history is that you point to a lot of this mistranslation, caricaturing, turning Christ into, as you put it, the tedious do-gooder. You describe it as a very modern phenomenon. So you say, this is for an age of liberal capitalism. This is for our society. Can I ask if I've got a very demanding dog? I'm sorry. Can I ask if has every age done this? Is this a has this happened since the gospel writers were first around? Is this a part of what it means to engage with these questions? Is it to reinvent them for your own beliefs?
I mean, you'll know this from reading literature. I mean, I think one of the images that I can't remember who came up with this, but one of the historical Jesus scholars of the 20th century just pointed out that everyone looking down the well of history at Jesus of Nazareth sees their own reflection staring back at them and takes it for his. It's inevitable that when we're trying to listen to another person on the other end of history, another person on the far side of a text, another person sat opposite us in the same room, regardless, human communication, I think, requires that, because we all communicate, having learned language, it requires that we impose something on them. We're always imposing ourselves onto what we see and hear and feel. And the question is not so much whether or not we do that, it's whether the person we experience has the capacity to answer back and change our interpretive filters so that we're less wrong next time we try to hear them, and so on. And you would hope that just as another person in the same room can answer back, if you listen well to an author or to a voice from history, they would have the capacity to answer back. I read Plato for the second time in 30 years, a couple of years ago, and I was astonished at how much he learned over the course of 30 years. He was a different Plato.
Yeah.
Because I was projecting different stuff onto him. I think I'd probably heard him the first time, allowed him to reshape my ethos, and then you're hearing a different person. So it feels, even when you're reading the same words, it still feels like a conversation. So yes, I think we're imposing this stuff as every age does. And the question is, does every age have the capacity, does every person have the capacity to be transformed by their encounter with the other? And I think that's what lies at the heart of what Christianity is.
I was just thinking what it reminded you of was what Keats says about Shakespeare, was that Shakespeare was a writer with what he called negative capability. And that meant that you could insert things you wanted into Shakespeare because he was somehow this great, very fertile writer for new interpretation. And that can be a very positive thing, but it can also allow a voice or a writer or a person to be distorted. And that's the very distortion you pick up on so well in the book. I wonder whether you think that our modern vision of Christ, the Christ in the 20th and the 21st century, is particularly distant. Has kind of liberal capitalism done something to our understanding of Christ that no other age has quite done? I've kept using the phrase "tedious do-gooder." It just sticks in my brain. I think that's certainly how a lot of people understand. Is just this like wishy-washy, be kind to others hero. Is that a particular perversion that this age is solely responsible for?
I think it was Hobbes who was marveling at how the masses of people whose lives are being wrecked by a very tiny minority never do anything about it. And part of one of the theories behind some ideologies of capitalism is that the masses of people who might be able to rise up and address the economic and ecological concerns that are going to end humanity if we're not careful. How is it that we are not all outraged all the time by this? How is that happening? If we all knew what was really happening, would we be doing something about it? And I think some of the I take the lead of people like Chris Hedges and Cornel West on questions like this, and look at how it seems to be that we're increasingly fragmented from one another, alienated from one another, atomized as individuals, not just individuals now, but individuals creating their own identities, identity being rooted in the word for idios, the idiot, the person who will not engage with the city-state, with the polis. How it is that our phones have trained us to be separated from one another. And the moment humanity is in isolation from one another, and we lack basic conversation, basic human interaction, and that basic feeling of community, which is the biggest, most widely raised mental health benefit, being as part of a community. Yeah. Until we can recapture that, I don't think there's any hope of recapturing any kind of accurate historical Jesus. These things all come together. The capacity to listen, I think, lies at the heart of everything we do as scholars and as human beings.
Very well put. I think so perhaps the fault lies with this obsession with the individual, the obsession with personal conviction above kind of a collective shared sense. Is that the Christ that needs rediscovering then? A Christ less as an individual and more as a comrade? You know, what my thought throughout the book was, what would Christ think about these identifications you were giving him? You know, if we were to say, as the book describes very well, that Christ would maybe be more aligned to very loosely termed left-wing politics, would that be something that Christ would recognize? Would Christ be, or Jesus be, just as outraged with the same sense of ecological collapse that modern capitalism harbors? Would Christ be similarly outraged with social inequality? You know, I suppose my question is, what would Jesus think about this idea of him as
I think going back to what we were saying earlier, all we can say is what I think Jesus would say at the moment, until I know this Jesus better.
Fine.
And I think in the book, I've tried to present the Jesus that I think I know, and it's up to somebody else to come along and say you've got this wrong.
Yeah.
And I will have got it wrong in certain areas, and I may have hit on something in certain other areas. But again, that's up to communities of people to explore with one another. I mean, we're all doing this all the time. So yeah, my hope is that we discuss it. And you would hope that the voice of this historical Jesus can still echo through the voices of other real people who are willing to engage with this stuff.
That's all I have. Thank you so much, Simon. That was terribly insightful. And yeah, you've really given a real powerful sense of what this book is trying to do. Thank you.
Max, this is magnificent. Thank you very much. I appreciate this.